So good evening, everyone, and welcome. So let's just start with a short reflection, meditation. Just allow ourselves to have a chance to let go of whatever we might be carrying with us from the day or from the week, it being a Friday night. Maybe we've got a lot of things on our mind, worries or concerns, and allow that to settle, to let go of that to some degree by doing some focused meditation. So I think most of you have some experience with meditation, but if not, don't worry. I'll give a few instructions to work with. So just find a place that's comfortable for your body, making sure that the back is straight, just bringing a relaxed tone to the body. You can close your eyes if you wish, or if you want to keep them slightly open, that's also good. And we'll do a meditation on the breath. The breath is with us all the time, so it's a very helpful object to develop some concentration, some calm, some mindfulness. So if you have a way already of working with the breath, you're welcome to do that. And if not, I'll suggest a way to work with the breath. And this involves focusing on the sensation at the tip of the nose. As you breathe in through the nostrils, as you breathe out, there's a very subtle sensation that occurs just inside the tip of the nose. And make that your meditation object, just simply staying present with it through the inhalation, through the exhalation. But of course the mind will wander. We don't have perfect concentration. And so when you suddenly find that you're thinking about some of those worries or concerns, or maybe you're getting distracted by plans for the weekend or for some time in the future, whatever it is that has distracted you, just simply make that decision to let that go, to not continue to follow it, and instead to return back to the breath. So I'll ring the chime, and we'll do this in silence for a few minutes, and then I'll lead you in some thoughts that can begin this exploration of tonight's topic, looking at complaining in our lives and perhaps some different ways of working with that. So now with our minds a bit more focused, let's examine some thoughts that will help us begin to explore this issue and also set a good intention for being here tonight. So the most fundamental teaching of the Buddha is that everything starts with our minds. In Buddhism, we're very much about working with our minds to find the sources of happiness within ourselves, to also be free from suffering by changing our minds. And so tonight, in the context of this issue of complaining, we're going to be examining how to work with our minds. So the initial level of motivation is to want to change your mind, to work with your mind, to find a deeper sense of inner peace and calm, a mind that perhaps won't be as agitated and frustrated by the things that we tend to complain about. That will find a way to work with those things that we can change and to accept the things that we can't and find a deeper way to continue to work with our minds and our thoughts to transform these situations as best as we can. But doing this initially with the thought that we ourselves will benefit from that. Without a doubt, our lives will become more content, more peaceful, once we adopt different ways of being in the world. So the first level of motivation is to simply want that for yourself. And to think that you're here tonight to explore this topic, to have an impact upon your own life, your own well-being. But because we live in a world with others, we know that we also have an effect on others. So wouldn't it be wonderful if also the work we do tonight could have some bearing on the lives of others, their well-being, their peace of mind, their contentment. So you might begin by holding in your thoughts those beings who perhaps are the people who hear the complaints that you have, the people whose lives perhaps might be enriched and improved upon if we were to find different ways to work with our situation, different ways to work with our minds. But we can even extend this to all other beings and think that we're here to do this work upon ourselves so we can eventually be of greatest benefit to them, helping all beings to find deeper peace and satisfaction, a deeper level of contentment and well-being. And that we're here tonight exploring this topic with that bigger motivation that encompasses not just your own welfare, but the welfare of others. And so hold that thought in mind right now, as well as throughout this evening as we explore this topic of what's so bad about complaining. Okay. So I mentioned last Thursday when I was here that these talks that I'm doing, that I kind of take on the road now with my traveling teaching, are actually talks that go back to around 2007, 2008 at our center in Santa Fe where I teach. And the intention behind them wasn't just for people practicing Buddhism, but for anybody, for many of the courses, to help them to have some practical advice in terms of their daily lives. We called this series of courses the Heart of Practice. And so I was inspired to do this one on complaining by actually a cartoon in the New Yorker. And in Buddhism, we talk an awful lot about suffering, right? Has everybody heard at least the word suffering once in a Buddhist teaching or a Buddhist book? So the scenario for this little cartoon is that there's a teacher, much like myself, except it's a monk in robes, and he's got his little, class of everyone sitting on their cushions, and a woman has her hand up and she says, "You say that life is suffering, but isn't it also complaining?" So these seems to, at some level, maybe we could say we're either suffering or we're complaining about our suffering. At some level, this is kind of our experience. Now, of course, we would probably call complaining a form of suffering in and of itself. We're going to explore this a little bit tonight. Much to my delight, Venerable Tupten Chodron has done a teaching on complaining that was at her website. So I'm going to draw a little bit from some of what she says and how she approached the subject. She actually called her teaching "My Favorite Pastime, Complaining." And maybe there's a lot of us that could say that's our favorite pastime. I think especially in this presidential election year, we hear a lot of complaining. Maybe we participate in a lot of complaining. But complaining is something that's kind of always been a part of our lives. I think kind of learned a lot about complaining perhaps from our families, from the way our parents would come home from work, and we'd kind of model that same behavior. So I think we have to begin by examining this whole idea of why do we complain? Does anybody want to answer that question for themselves? Why do you complain? What is the motivation in saying something that is a complaint about your life, about what others are doing or saying, or who they are, or what they look like, or whatever the case might be? Anybody? Why do you complain? Yeah, Steve.
Well, there's some shared sort of community
Okay.
in complaining. I complain to you, you sympathize with me, and say,
All
okay,
right.
yeah, that's true. And by the way, you complain to me, and I sympathize.
It's like mutual complaining therapy. Yeah, well, they say misery loves company. Maybe this is part of it too. We really do, kind of have that. When somebody empathetically listens to our complaining and we listen to theirs, it does become a bit of that cycle. This is a good one. I think this is near the top of the list for most of us, right? I kvetch to you, you kvetch to me, Lynn, what were you going to add something?
Don't break them up, you just say
Kvetch. Okay, sorry, the non-Hebrew in me. Were you going to add anything? No.
I just think that's what most conversations are.
Okay, all right. Yeah, Venerable Carol.
Well, I was just thinking,
Uh-huh.
talking about complaining that, especially around older people, everybody complains about,
Yeah.
how they're feeling, how their body's not doing what they want, you got this pain and that. And it comes from the self-cherishing mind, right? It's like
Yeah.
venting a bit about
Sure.
just why, about our pains and our suffering.
Uh-huh.
And it could be even outside, things aren't going the way I like, so I vent.
Yeah.
Just complain to myself.
Sure.
Just say it. The room
Right.
will be empty.
Yeah.
Why do I say that?
Yeah, I don't think it necessarily has to have another person involved.
That's right.
We can be in complaining mode all by ourselves. But no, these are all really good things involved in it. I think it is kind of a favorite pastime for a lot of people. And certainly I have to agree, as I age, it does seem like there are more things I could complain about. I'm always reminded of that film, 16 Candles, where she's coming up on her 16th birthday, and she goes upstairs to see the grandparents that have just shown up for the wedding of her sister, and all they do, she says, how you doing, Grandma and Grandpa? Oh, my back is breaking, this is hurting, and my feet, and that. It becomes this whole litany of all these things that they're complaining about. But it is a form of venting, very much. It's kind of like we feel like in some way when we put it out there, that there perhaps is even a little bit of a relief to some degree, that we've communicated it to others and we maybe have a little more space around it. But it can often, become a little obsessive. Yeah. What are some other thoughts? Yes.
I think sometimes also it's to legitimize it. So you
Sure.
say it and then that person agrees with you and then you feel like, oh, I was right to be annoyed.
This is another big one. Yeah. I think that when we have people who kind of validate what we're complaining about, that gives us some sort of feeling of righteous indignation even, of like, well, I know what I'm talking about, and I'm right in complaining about that. It is a problem, and we need to deal with that. So I think that that's very much a part of it too. And in some ways, again, if we look at each of these things, we can see that maybe there's some aspect of it that could be seen as beneficial, but the way that we're going about getting that, like the feeling of connection you're speaking to, which is a part of that. We're doing it through the medium of complaining, but what we're really striving for is to feel some sort of validation of who we are, our own opinions, our feelings, in the face of another person hearing all of that. So it's interesting, and this is what we're going to explore a little bit tonight, is kind of getting to the surface of how do we work with, because it's not to say that all of our complaints should just be thrown out the window. When we say with this title, what's so bad about complaining, that complaints serve no purpose, it's rather that we have to look at the underlying motivations behind why we're engaging in that behavior and see if there's some room to work within that, and to see that certainly those things that we are complaining about that can be remedied, there's great energy in putting effort into that and not necessarily into just complaining all the time. So we'll talk a little bit about that too. What are some other thoughts? What was your name, by the way? Your
My
name?
name is Kate.
Kate. Thank you, Kate, for that. Yeah. Anyone else? Yes, Marianne, right?
It's a way of letting somebody else around you know what may be going on with you.
Sure.
You could probably say it in a more constructive way, but generally, well, not generally, it can be versus complaint. And what you're trying to say, hey, there's something going on with me.
Right, right. Could be maybe, you mean like a bit of a call for help, perhaps, or? Yeah. Okay.
Frustration, but letting
Yeah.
people around you know that there's something going on that you're not
Right.
happy
Good.
or content.
Uh-huh. And again, some of this, I think, again, has some aspects of validity to it that we can begin to isolate out and then move away from, perhaps, once more, as we'll explore tonight, some of these behaviors that do become a little more problematic in terms of complaining. But this is great. Thanks, Marianne. Anyone else? Why you complain?
I think because
Mhm.
sometimes we feel helpless. We're frustrated.
This is a
we're
big one.
unhappy,
Yeah.
And we don't have any way to change whatever it is that's bothering us.
Uh-huh.
And so it's kind of an outlet of feeling very frustrated and hopeless or helpless.
Right, right. And what's your name?
I'm
Sally,
Sally.
yes. Yeah, I think what Sally's saying is very much a part of a lot of what we complain about. Complaining, or again, the idea of venting. But with those situations where we do feel somewhat helpless, or we do feel like, it's bigger than what we are, it's something that we maybe even can't change. But the complaining about it, the venting about it, might make us feel like we're actually doing something. Again, we'll explore that idea as well. Anything else that anybody wanted to share in this regard? So there's lots of reasons why we complain. And as I said earlier, I think what we really want to do is begin to look at the motivations we have behind our complaining and just try to get clear in terms of our own minds. When is it beneficial for us to actually bring into our awareness things that are not quite right? When is it maybe not as beneficial, but perhaps to put more energy into changing our minds, rectifying the situation? Lots of different options that are out there that might be more productive ways of working with that. So let me take a look at my notes here. There were a few more things that that when Venerable Tipton Chodron taught on this, that she had for why do we complain. Maybe I'll share a few of those so you get an idea of some of the things that she felt were also a part of this. She said in every one of the cases, when, in her estimation, when we complain, we're looking for something, even though we may not be aware of what it is at the time. That's kind of an interesting statement, because it sort of helps us to examine, well, what is it that we're looking for in regard to all of our complaints? Sometimes it is the justification, the validation of what we're saying. Sometimes it's the venting. Sometimes it's simply the frustration in dealing with situations that we can't change. But she says, this idea that we did talk about, simply sometimes we want someone to recognize our suffering. Say, hey, I get it, you're suffering. You're dealing with some really difficult stuff there. Sometimes we do hope that others are going to fix our problem. Sometimes there's a complaining because we don't necessarily want to take responsibility for fixing the problem ourselves, right? We want to actually put that onus on someone else. Well, I complained to the management about it. Why isn't the management doing something about that problem? Well, again, we do have to be clear about where responsibilities lie. That's not to say that we should think that we have to fix everything, but sometimes that is, what a complaint is about, is putting the onus on someone else. This is what you were saying, Sally, was to vent our emotions and our feelings of powerlessness. She says, Venerable Tipton Chodron says, we criticize government policies, the corruption of CEOs, and the politicking of the politicians that prevents them from actually caring for the country. We dislike these things, but we feel powerless to change them. I would say this is a lot of what's going on in our current political climate, is why there's a lot of complaining, and it seems like even the media is buying into this so much, of really exacerbating the feeling of disgruntledness at the candidates, at the situation in the country, what have you, is simply to vent that kind of powerlessness that people feel. And again, maybe putting the onus on people who may not be able to really fix the problems that we're looking at. Of course, one of the things that we understand in Buddhism with the belief in karma has many facets to it, but one of the elements of karma, of our sort of causes and conditions behind our experiences, is that we complain because we've complained in the past. This just really means that complaining is a habit, right? And what's nice about this sort of idea behind complaining in Buddhism, or any of the things that we want to address in regard to our lives, is that because they are habitual patterns in our minds, they do have a strength behind them. That's sort of the karmic component, is that we're driven to do them again and again because we've done them so much in the past. This is how any habit forms. But the kind of saving grace within all of this is the fact that those are not cast in stone. In spite of the fact that you might have a deeply ingrained desire to open your mouth and complain about everything that goes on that you find difficult, the reality is it doesn't have to be that way. The mind is just as malleable when it comes to forming new habits and new patterns, new ways of not complaining at every little difficulty, every hangnail, every car that upsets us, whatever the case might be. So this is one of the underlying things, that understanding that our current habits are very much influenced by what we've done in the past. If we change what we're doing now in the present, we're changing our future habits. So this is, again, something that will come up in the rest of tonight as well. And then kind of correlated a little bit to what I was saying earlier, is this idea that perhaps we aren't willing to take the responsibility to change things. I think sometimes we do complain simply because complaining is a lot easier than fixing the situation. And there are difficult situations that we face. So sometimes that can seem rather daunting to do something to actually try to make a difference. But if we do look at it from the point of view that all of the energy we put into complaining, all the time that we spend talking about things that we just don't like in our world, in our lives, and so on, if we put all of that energy into fixing those situations or doing something to rectify even how we're thinking about them, we'd be more content, much happier. Because if we look at the mind of complaining, I'm not saying that it's always a mind that is going to feel like a mind of discontent, but it certainly has that component to it. Sometimes we're actually happy complaining. We have an element of just enjoying our complaining. But if we examine the underlying pattern, we do see that it's one of keeping the mind from really finding any real peace or rest, because we're agitated by things. We're trying to vent all of that within a context of not really, again, getting to any place of peace, but rather generally a place of being more upset. So let's start to talk a little bit about the ways that we rectify this, the ways that we work with this, and this will be most of what we're going to deal with in the rest of tonight. The first topic, though, is this idea of, is there a real difference then between what we would call simply discussing something versus complaining? Because I think we do have to delineate these two. Because otherwise, someone said earlier, right, that we think that we're complaining all the time. Well, I'm not so sure. I would say some discussions that we have about things that are going on in our world, concerns that we have with regard to climate change or with regard to economic inequality or with regard to many issues that we could certainly complain about, but it's also good to discuss those issues. It's also good to have some knowledge of those issues, to make firm stands with regard to those issues. So this is one thing to delineate, is that by complaining, we are talking about a more specific way that we are elevating the emotional content of what we're talking about in a way that causes us to have some frustration, some anxiety, that isn't about making some sort of assertment of where we want to go, the idea of the sort of path that we think should be followed in order for there to be greater well-being. So having the idea, thank you, Urs, having the idea that, for example, with regard to something like climate change, if you were simply complaining about it all the time, just really tired of politicians that aren't taking care of it and tired of people who aren't taking responsibility for their actions, well, those sorts of thoughts, again, tend to create cycles where we just create more suffering for ourselves. If instead we sit there and think about all the ways that we could maybe become an agent for helping people to have more awareness of climate change in their lives, or we were thinking about ways to help alert our politicians and other people in the world about ways that they could make some difference in regard to that issue, those would be much more productive ways of dealing with the same frustration, right? At some level, we've got that desire for things to be different. It's going back to, again, what Venerable Thupten Chodron is saying. Each of the ways that we or reasons why we complain is coming from a fundamental place of wanting things to change. Change for the better. Change for the better for ourselves, hopefully also for others. So if we are able to move away from what we would call complaining into more valid discussion, really sitting down and informing ourselves, informing others about what's going on, I think we'd have a much different perspective in regard to the issues in our world that we generally complain about. Of course, it does take some skill in making our discussions be much more fruitful, to keep them from going to that place of becoming complaining. But there are other antidotes that we need to apply besides just simply acknowledging that discussion could be more fruitful. So let's take a look at a few of those. Any comments yet on that? On anything I've talked about yet? Yeah, Lynn.
I didn't comment earlier, but when I kind of believe that a lot of conversations involve a complaint, noticing something that's not going the way we want it. And I'm not saying that they're just whining the whole time, or we're just whining, but it is a good basis, especially I have a particular friend. It's like, ooh, we can now deconstruct this through the
Sure.
lens. We kind of look forward to well, let's pick out. So, in other words, somebody came in and complained, and then we go, well, yeah, but what about if we look at it? Like that. So it's yeasty.
It can be, yeah.
You were just saying that. It can lead to
Right,
discovery of
right,
all of us all in a way.
right. And I think that's one of the useful tools. If we can move things from hearing it as, the whining might be a starting point, like you're saying, might be the introduction of the problem, but to keep moving it into a mode of discussion and saying, well, let's really look at what would need to happen in order for the situation to change. That's much more productive. It's also certainly, of course, about creating interconnection as opposed to separation, me and my complaining and them and their problem and that they're causing me. Again, to try to find ways to cross those bridges and make sure that we work on always solving, making more solutions to the problems of the world as opposed to exacerbating the suffering that we have. So that's absolutely, thank you for bringing that up. Any other comments on this? Discussion versus complaining? Are you able to notice, just looking back on your own life, when you start moving from one to the other? Because sometimes things even start as discussion and go the opposite way, right? You're just talking about something and then suddenly the emotional level starts to rise and it becomes more about, oh, that's so-and-so and what they're doing and I can't stand it and I want to just, scream and whatever. Anyone want to speak to any of that in their own lives? I'm making you all do some work tonight. I'm not going to just go blah, blah, blah for 2 hours. Anyone? Okay. All right. So let's start to look at the antidotes to complaining. How do we actually begin to overcome complaining? When we start having these sorts of patterns in our lives, I think it's important, and one of the tools that's used in Buddhism frequently is to have what we would call kind of antidotes. Many of you are familiar with this concept in regard to, and I think we even talked about a little bit last Thursday, when we have negative patterns that are happening in our mind, we introduce thoughts that help to shift the energy, shift the direction that our thoughts are going in. And so I'd say one of the main things that we can come to understand about the situations that we're looking at are involved in these types of antidotes that we want to have. And let's look at a few of those. Some of these are similar to even what I talked about last night at Seichen Ling in regard to how we work with our problems, our difficulties. Because obviously those are the things that we tend to complain about. I don't think we complain about somebody being too kind to us, perhaps. Well, maybe some of us do. But we don't complain about the weather being really nice. We don't complain about all the pleasant things. We complain about the suffering, the problems. So one of the first understandings actually may go back to that cartoon, right? Of understanding that life is suffering. I mean, a lot of times we complain about things without really acknowledging that what's underlying that is an expectation that it's not supposed to be that way, that things are supposed to be going smoothly, that they're supposed to be going our way. So this is one of the understandings that Buddhism is very much rooted in, is saying that this is the nature of our existence, that things are going to be unsatisfactory at some level. Even some of the things that we have in our lives that we think are really quite satisfying, if we examine them more deeply, we find that they're not satisfying to the degree that we would like them to be. And this is the nature of existence. It can be a little eye-opening to see things in that way. But if we have that understanding, the complaining that comes from the expectation that we're not going to have those difficulties, that we're not going to have those problems, begins to be undermined because there's no longer that expectation. This is what you shared earlier in the car today, Lynn. Lynn drove me down here as well as to Aptos to visit Rinpoche's house. And this was from someone else you said, I can't remember who it was, who said, wake up every morning with the thought of what's going to be the first thing to go wrong. And who was it that said that? Oh, Venerable Chucky.
That was a practice she tried.
A practice that, I think would be quite useful. Why do we wake up every day with the feeling that it's all going to go right? I mean, this is our default mode, right? That when we wake up, it's all going to be our day. It's our life with us at the center of it and everyone else filling our needs, doing what we want them to do. All the cars magically getting out of your way as you're driving. All the parking spots immediately opening up for the best one for you. I mean, why do we think that it's all supposed to go that way, as opposed to saying, I mean, this sounds kind of don't get me wrong, we were talking about optimism and pessimism earlier too in the teaching last week. Don't get me wrong in saying that, what we should really be doing is being pessimistic all the time. We should be realistic all the time. And the realist approach is not to expect it all to go really well, but to be prepared for things to not go our way. And then the complaining is, again, there's no energy behind it because complaining is generally coming from that place of expecting things to go our way. So if we're able to let that go by saying, things are going to go wrong today. It's not all going to go my way. I'm not going to get my way at work. I'm not going to have everybody being kind to me. Everything is going to flow through the day. There'll be ups, there'll be downs, there'll be sometimes my way, sometimes someone else's way, and that's just the way that it is. So the complaining doesn't have much energy in that light. Was your hand up? Oh, okay. All right. Anyone want to share anything on that? Okay. So what's another antidote? Another familiar antidote in Buddhism is recognizing impermanence. And by impermanence here, we mean the fact that not just that things sometimes completely cease, which some things do, certainly. This life comes to an end, presidential terms come to an end, presidential races come to an end. can be grateful that all these things come to an end, that they're impermanent. But we also mean that things are changing constantly. That things don't stay the same from day to day, from moment to moment. And so if we look at that mind of complaining, I would say one of the other underlying thoughts behind it is why we're complaining is because we are seeing things as being somewhat more permanent than they actually are. We're seeing them as being a lot more unchanging than they actually are. The fact that things are going to be constantly changing, we can take some comfort in that, actually, because things won't stay the same. The way that situation appears, and I'm sure we've all had that situation in our own lives, where one day it seemed like such an enormous problem. Maybe it was brand new coming into our lives, and all we could do was complain. And then within a day or two, it didn't seem so significant. Something shifted, something changed. And suddenly what we thought was so heated and so difficult has actually become much easier to deal with. So when the mind of complaining is operative, just like the mind that has any kind of resistance to problems or difficulties, we think that it's fixed. We think that it's not going to go through some process of change. So meditating on impermanence, kind of holding this concept within our understanding that things do shift, things do change. Any experiences in that regard anybody wanted to share? Not getting any words out. It's okay. All right, let's go on. Another thing that would be useful, another antidote frequently to these sorts of thoughts, is to work within the concept of compassion. We might start with compassion for ourselves. Again, when we are complaining, we might think that that's some level of compassion for ourselves, right? Because the reason why I'm complaining is because I'm suffering. And so if I'm complaining, it's because I care about my suffering and I want my suffering to end. Right?
Wow, they're working hard at that. Come on. Really?
I think so. Well, I think that that's the thought behind it. But I'm saying that that's not what we can do, certainly. Right? If we think that we can actually get our suffering to end by complaining, then complaining would be awesome practice, exactly. Maybe we'd be teaching it in Buddhism rather than teaching to not complain. So the reality is that does that really help you in the end, that complaining? Does it get rid of the suffering that you are reacting to? The suffering of thinking about that event in your life or what that person said to you that harmed you. Does that complaining about it actually rectify the situation for yourself? If you had genuine compassion for yourself, once more the energy would go into how do I actually work within the context of my own suffering, to have a deeper understanding of where this comes from, to work with my mind to reframe things so that I'm not in this cycle of complaining that's all about just perpetuating my suffering mind that is taking offense at what's going on. So if we instead kind of begin to pull back and say the most compassionate thing to do for myself is to refrain from that type of behavior, to actually do what I can to try to find some peace of mind within myself with regard to the situation. Again, within the understanding that the situation isn't permanent, that it will change, that there will be factors that will shift the energy, shift what's going on. But even when we have compassion for others, I think our complaining can be reduced through those sorts of thoughts too. I mean, if we use situations that we're complaining about that involve others that we're complaining about, well, how are we looking at those people when we're complaining about them? Anyone, what are your thoughts? When you're complaining about somebody who's done something to you, what is the underlying thought about those people? Or thoughts? There's probably a number of them. Anybody?
Judging them as being wrong.
Right, that's a big one. So we got a big judgment there. They are wrong and we are right. They're the offender, we're the offended. Right? Yeah, Venerable Carol.
Just a thought for their feelings.
Exactly.
They have no feelings. They're just out there being an offender.
Right. They're doing things, their feelings don't matter. They're just an agent of harm for us. They're just like some inanimate object that is coming into our lives and causing us harm, and we aren't thinking about who they are. We aren't thinking about their minds or what's driving them to do what they're doing. We're not looking at the totality of the situation. Yeah, Venerable Carol.
The other thing, I was just thinking about what you said before about interconnection.
Mm-hmm.
We also see that it's very separate.
Right.
No connection except this harm.
Right.
Blocked.
So all of the things that would bring us some peace of mind at that time, if we had more spaciousness around it, if we were looking at that person as a suffering being, a being that is dealing with their own states of mind that cause them to do that harm, to do those things, if we looked at them as a being who we actually could benefit perhaps by helping them in the face of what they're doing to us or saying to us, if we could begin to open up to a more compassionate view of them, once more, complaining doesn't have any ground, because complaining is based on these types of views, these judgments, and seeing them as the offender and ourselves in that kind of victim, offendee kind of role. So compassion in that regard, when we're complaining about other people, there's a whole window that opens up when we start to look at that situation very differently. When suddenly it doesn't become this hard, fast role that they're playing in regard to our situation, and we begin to see the dynamic quality of that, the interconnectedness of it, the fact that we could actually be of more benefit to them at that time, rather than complaining. Because we might be complaining to them, but we might also be complaining to others who rally with us against them, kind of making their lives even more difficult and frustrating. Because once we get everyone on our side to agree that that's a wrong person, that they wronged us in this way, well then they're facing not just us, but also many others that could be involved in complicating their lives, having creating more suffering for them even perhaps. So compassion kind of begins to open up a whole other dimension of exploring the issue. I think we also, when we start working with other issues that are maybe where it's a bigger issue, like the climate change type of stuff, and we start working there as opposed to someone who's just offended you, but a situation that affects many beings, well, once again, what's the most compassionate approach to that type of situation? To try to work towards relieving the suffering, as opposed to doing things that simply go in a circle, kind of continuing to complain and whine and vent, and nothing ever happening, nothing ever shifting. Were you going to add something? Yeah.
I was also thinking about a different kind of complaining, the kind of complaining we were talking about initially of just our own suffering. And
Mhm.
sometimes, being able to raise compassion, thinking about others who are suffering
Sure.
more than we are.
Yeah, yeah.
It's also a way to use compassion to deflate our own
Mhm.
suffering, our own, complaining in that way.
Mhm.
Because
Yeah.
you just start thinking about how bad I've got it. You expand that a little bit.
Exactly.
It makes you happy.
Yeah, this is a big one too in regard to working with that. I think that's always very good advice. I mean, so many of us get our minds completely in a knot over something that, in relative terms, is really quite trivial. I mean, again, I'm not trivializing anybody else's suffering, but we all should be able to look at that for ourselves. Why we do that for ourselves is because it allows us to not get stuck in that really tight place, as was mentioned earlier, of self-cherishing, that tight place of looking at it only from the perspective of me, myself, and I, and my suffering. So back on those situations where it is something that someone has done to you, my gosh, there's always somebody we can look at and say, they're suffering worse than I. They're dealing with situations that, in the light of those, my situation is not as trivial. So what am I complaining about? Actually, I have things pretty good. I'd say a corollary to that is to look at all the good things in your life, rather than focusing on the complaints, the things that really, get our goat. Those sorts of things, once more, are much, for most of us, I'd say, those are the smaller portion of your life. The greater portion of your life are actually the people who do support you, and the things that actually are happening to make your life relatively comfortable. In this world that we live in, and we're certainly in, we like to think in this country and look at there's the 1% and the 99%. But when we look at the whole world, we're in the higher percentile, regardless of where we are in the 1 or the 99. And the world that we live in is certainly many people in much worse conditions, much, much worse. So this is certainly a big part of it, is to open up to compassion at that time, compassion for ourselves by releasing ourselves from these sorts of patterns, ways of looking at things that cause our complaining to continue, compassion for others by recognizing that they too are dealing with minds that are crazy, minds that are deluded, minds that are distorted. Of course, the one thing I was alluding to a little bit earlier that's actually encapsulated in a verse from Master Shantideva, who's a great Buddhist saint in the 8th century, Indian Buddhist, who basically says in this is the 10th verse of the 6th chapter of his text, the Way of the Bodhisattva. He says that if it's something that can be rectified, well then we could substitute here, he didn't use the word complain, but we could say, why complain? Or why worry? Why get your self all agitated about something that actually can be rectified? If it's something that is a situation that there is some change that can be affected, well, your complaining, your worry, your being agitated about it doesn't do any good. Whereas if you put something into rectifying the situation, the energy into it, that's where the energy should go. Yes, it was Kate? No. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And had many different complaints about how politics is going and all.
Uh-huh.
It seems to me that perhaps one could focus on one topic and do all that one could to rectify it. But then what happens to all these others? Do you just turn your mind off to them and not give them energy because you can't take on the whole world?
Sure.
Just focus on one?
Again, it would probably have to relate to the individual situation, but the way I'm hearing that, my feeling would be that, again, we do have limited time and energy in terms of what we can put energy into rectifying in our lives and in the world around us. But I think we have to find where some level of passion is with regard to ourselves and where we think we can actually make a difference. For some of us, we may feel like some issues, we do feel that sense of powerlessness and don't feel like we can maybe tackle, how to rectify those in our world. So we start maybe with those things that give us some confidence and some feeling like we are contributing.
And then for the others, does one just read them out of our consciousness? Turn the back on them? Turn them over to somebody else? Know our limitations and just be grateful that we have one topic with which we do feel at the same time?
I like that last one. I think we have to know our limitations and recognize that we can't possibly tackle everything in the world. But with the subject we're talking about tonight, I think it's important that we not kind of invest our time and energy into complaining about all of those things. If there are some things we can't do something about because of our own feeling of, again, I want to put my energy into this issue, this cause, because this is where I see myself making a big difference, then we don't spend a lot of time and energy on those other things, but still maintain an awareness of those, sure, to the best that we can. Because things may even shift in our own lives, and suddenly what we thought we were very passionate about, we feel somewhat resolved in our own minds as to the way we've contributed, and there's something else that we could potentially, work on. But the biggest thing in Buddhism too, and I just want to emphasize this as part of this question that you brought up, is that fixing things outside of ourselves isn't always going to be the final solution. And the most important solution in Buddhism is to start with fixing things inside ourselves in terms of the situations that we're facing. And what I mean by that is that we have to work with our minds in terms of keeping our motivations quite clear, keeping these ideas of compassion for everyone involved. That means not just the people, like say we get really passionate about what's happening to our environment with regard to oil companies and or fracking, whatever, all these different things that are. So then you become really passionate about that, but you hold in your mind the compassion that involves not just the people who are being negatively impacted, not just people, but even sentient other beings who are being negatively impacted by that. But you also hold in your mind the people who are perpetrating those acts, the people who are causing those sorts of fracking, what have you, all these different things that we could get a lot of energy around. So your efforts in changing the outside world are going to be more effective when you've changed the inside world, when you've actually gotten very clear in your own heart about embracing the entire situation, the totality of that. As we were saying earlier, if we have that judgment that thinks that these are the wrong people, these are the people doing the bad thing, these are people who are evil, and then there's us who are on the side of good, that us and them mentality is not going to be productive. So fixing the outside is sometimes a part of the equation, but it usually starts with fixing the inside. Does that make some sense? And then I think we get really clear once we have our inside a little more adjusted. We know exactly how we're going to look at the world, how we're going to embrace the problems, the difficulties that we were complaining about to try to make some change. Then we have a little bit clearer idea of how we're even going to do that. And we don't create more suffering, more difficulty. But yeah, there's so much that we could get passionate about. It's endless. So I think we all do have to find our own little piece of the world that we want to make some contribution to. But once more, recognize that it starts with working on ourselves so we can do that type of work much clearer. Because a lot of times we're not even going to see the results of the work that we do in the outside world because it's quite complex. But we still can do it. But we do it with good motivation, with good hearts. So, does that help some then? Yeah. Any other comments on this? So this is the first line of this little verse from Master Shantideva, the first 2 lines. If it's something that can be rectified, something you can do something about, well, don't spend your time complaining. Don't spend your time, putting all that energy into that. Put your time into rectifying the situation. The second line is, if it's something you can't do anything about, well, don't put all your energy in complaining about that either. Why? Because it's so futile. Your worry, your complaining, you're in being so invested in trying to combat that situation that isn't changeable. Now again, very few things are not changeable in our world, right? There are some things that certainly when things have taken off in a particular direction, it becomes very hard to return back to where you started. It becomes very hard to unwind the clock and get back to a place where we didn't have these problems. But it doesn't mean that the problems are completely unsolvable. It just means it takes a different type of mindset to undo the problems, to actually get back to that place or to a different place where we can actually have what we're seeking. Again, this mind of complaining is about seeking, about trying to find some sort of solution. But in those situations where you look at it and say, there's really nothing I can do about this. Well, complaining is not going to do much good because there's nothing productive that can come out of that. Because it's something that can't be rectified, can't be changed. Some people might complain, let's say some people frequently complain about aging, right? Yeah. Anybody in the room complain about aging? So, can you do anything about aging? Can you stop, Dorian Gray? Can you have a picture in your closet that ages while you stay the same, You maintain this youthful countenance while everybody, else is growing old. You can happily stay 22 or whatever. No, it just doesn't happen. So why do we complain about aging? Again, some of the same reasons we talked about earlier, but is there any usefulness in it? And going back to what Lynn was saying, if that complaint actually gets you into some healthy dialogue and discussion of what to do about it, that's great. But if you're complaining about aging, what is it that you're really going to do with regard to that? Other than Botox and whatever. A lot of people have found a lot of ways to deal with aging, but they don't stop the process, right? They just mask it. They just put another face on it, another whatever, so. Literally true. All too true. They permanently affix another face on it. So I really like, and His Holiness the Dalai Lama quotes this verse frequently because I think it's a wonderful reminder that when we're dealing with things in our lives, in our world, that all the worry and the complaining and all that, we have to see its uselessness. There really is not a lot that can come out of it because the energy has to go into either rectifying the situation or at some level accepting it. This is what I was saying earlier in terms of understanding and viewing that suffering is a part of our experience. That's something we have to acknowledge and accept. It doesn't mean that things can't change. The Buddha went on after, speaking to this truth to say that there can be a shift, an end to all of our suffering. And that's the good news that the Buddha brought, of course, that there can be actually freedom from that, a complete cessation of our suffering. So that's the energy we'd put into practicing the Buddhist path that leads to that. But even in our everyday lives, simply to have an acceptance that there is suffering in all of our lives. And this is part and parcel of being a living, breathing being on this planet. And that's some level of acceptance. It doesn't mean, again, we don't do something to change individual situations. And certainly we should be driven by compassion to change others' situations, to not have them suffer so greatly. But we have to acknowledge that this is part of the world. It's hard. I think it's one of the harder things to really get. So I want to move on to some degree. Let me say there's one more thing that I thought was kind of an interesting point that I added to the notes here. That's another way to work with the mind of complaining, is to stop identifying with the complaining mind and see it as kind of, this was a term that I think, what's her name? Thupten Yeshe, who taught the first module of Discovering Buddhism. Some of you may have encountered her before. She calls it space junk. Space junk. And she means just kind of like the stuff that's floating around in your head, just like the stuff that's floating around in space from all of the missions we've had and all the stuff, the satellites and all. That the complaining is kind of like space junk. It's kind of like just stuff coming up in our minds. I mean, I'd say any of the delusions that we have, because complaining to some extent, I wouldn't call it like an absolute delusion, but it's usually informed by some delusion, is to not identify so much with those delusions. This is true for anger in particular. I mean, why do we think we're angry people? Well, we're just people with that space junk floating through our minds, that stuff we call anger, that is there, and we can choose to grab onto it and identify with it and think that's who we are, or we can simply find a more spacious way to work with it, recognize it's just kind of floating in our minds. It kind of is conditioning our thoughts, but it's not really the absolute nature of our minds. Of course, in Buddhism, we have this idea that our minds are free of all that space junk. That space junk is just floating there. The domain in which all of that is floating is what we mean by mind. So there's a lot more room to work with all of this. When we kind of tighten the mind to that degree where we start complaining, it's obvious that we are beginning that process of identifying with that space junk, kind of letting that become who we are. Some of the most simplest teachings, Geshe Jampa Gyatso, who Emily and I studied with over in Italy, he used to emphasize so much just maintaining, a happy mind, a relaxed mind. And I can't tell you how useful that was to hear throughout those 7 years of study, because, there was a lot we could complain about, and I think we did complain about actually. Could complain about Aldo's food, we could complain about, the living conditions and complain about, but nonetheless, when Geshe-la would say to us, you have to keep a happy mind, you have to relax, Sometimes he'd say it in Italian, rilassati, rilassati, So I think, this is just even one antidote to the complaining mind frequently, is when we see our mind, that energy starting to go in that direction, we create more space around it. Right? Why are we grabbing onto that and just going for that ride when we could just simply let it dissipate of its own accord, just sort of float away? So what I want to talk about for the rest of the time that we have is, and let me see if there's any comments on our own complaining, because what I want to move into is, what do we do when others are complaining to us? Because I think that's an important part of this. But yes.
I just wanted to make a quick comment.
Sure.
That I love complaining because I always feel a million times better when I've complained, and I've gotten it out of my system, and I think, oh, I feel renewed and rejuvenated, and then I go on my way. But what I realized not too many years ago of just what it does to the listener. And I think the listener
Yeah.
does not appreciate that at all. I think even when I hear other people complaining, I'm like, oh, they're complaining again. But I don't recognize it in my own self. I'm like critiquing, I'm not complaining, or, I have all these other
It's euphemisms for complaining. Yeah.
Yeah, but for me it's wonderful, but it's not for the listener at all. So I try to take that into consideration.
This is all great. What's your name?
Oh, Heidi.
Heidi.
I'm
What?
Sally Hudson's daughter.
Oh, okay. Okay, good. Well, Heidi, I think everything you're saying is. I really appreciate your honesty, because I think we all could say that. At some level, there is a real sense of, now I've gotten all my stuff out and I've thrown it all out, so I don't have to carry it around anymore because I've done all that I need to do, and complaining to everyone else about all this stuff that irritates me. And so there is a bit of that uplifting feeling because you've dumped it on somebody else's doorstep. And I like how you are able to see that, willing to see that that isn't such a nice thing from your own experience to have that all kind of dumped on your door and feel like, now all of a sudden it's in somebody else's court or somebody else has to listen to it. Or I think this is again, we have to look at, first of all, there might be that feeling of relief, but is it really something that gets rid of all the complaining? Because the next day we probably have a whole new set of things that we could complain about. And if this becomes our pattern, that we feel like we have to engage in that type of thing in order to feel some sense of relief, once more, it's not providing any real solid basis for that. It's only temporary. It's only getting it off my plate until it comes back and bothers me again, and then I have to get it off my plate. And is this how we want to, again, live our lives? That energy of always trying to keep that kind of cleared off of our plate. And with just entertaining this idea that would it be more beneficial to put that energy into the discussions that, again, could possibly lead to maybe a reduction in some of that irritation and suffering for ourselves, a better understanding and connection with others, if we're actually able to sit down and talk about what could change. Again, it might be useful to have a more specific example to work with, but we all know this from our lives, that if you actually are able to stop the complaining and sit down and talk about what it is that's difficult for you and try to get the understanding from the other person as to what's going on for them, why they are doing what they're doing, inevitably there's much more benefit to that. Yeah. Being on the receiving end of it, we do see what it's like to have that. So I appreciate everything you shared, because once more I think we could all say that. And that's one reason why we complain frequently too, is it feels like a nice sort of dumping. But we've thrown that sort of toxic stuff out there then, and someone else is kind of holding it. And what do they do with it? We just keep passing it along, It's like, who wants this pile of dung, Thank you, I'll just pass. But we keep creating more piles, and we keep throwing more piles out there, and it becomes really kind of messy. So it doesn't really produce what we're wanting it to do. And that's, I guess, the proof that it really isn't a productive activity. As I said, it might feel like that, and you have that experience, and I think we all do, but good. Yes?
Is there a value into journal writing?
Journal writing?
Writing it down?
Well, I think there's maybe some benefit in terms of it not involving another person that we're venting to. But I would still question as long as we're engaging in the behavior, be it, again, because someone was saying they complained to themselves, right? Where was that? That was Venerable Carol. Nobody's being harmed by that. We're not dumping a pile of stuff for anyone else to deal with. But we're doing that behavior again and again and again. Going back to that idea I mentioned earlier, that we have sort of that karmic concept that we are the creators of our own patterns and habits. And so if we do that continually, even if it's just to ourselves, by writing, well, we are in that frame of mind. You know, we are kind of creating that behavior. And the tendency too, in my opinion, is that even when we do it privately or in our journals, inevitably it starts to seep out and become something more public because of the strength of that, continuing to do that type of behavior. Maybe not for everyone, but I would say for a large part of, the population, if they are doing that. And thinking about writing, I would hope people would want to sit down and write something that would be much more fulfilling and creative than writing all of that too. But the main point is that that's just going to keep the behavior going and not really address it. It may not harm others, but it harms ourselves. Well, possibly. And this is where, again, I'm in no way would I say that we shouldn't entertain the things that are irritating us, kind of bring them into our sphere of thinking and working with. There may be some real value to that, but to do it in a much more wholesome mode, a wholesome environment. This is something I always try to emphasize, is that we frequently just talk about meditation as if it just simply means sitting there quietly. Well, sit there quietly for a bit to calm the mind, but then use that calmer mind to start to investigate things in our lives. Like, say you are having an issue with somebody in your life that is causing you a lot of consternation. They're saying things to you that are upsetting you. And so if you sit there quietly with that, not from that point of view of, why are they doing this to me, and that victim perpetrator kind of mode, but maybe trying to see it from the perspective of, what is it that would maybe shift the situation? How could I possibly work to produce some form of change? Or how can I even begin to see the other person through that lens of compassion I was mentioning earlier? All these kinds of ideas, if you sit and introduce them in your sitting meditation, that's really just a form of thinking, reflection. It's like journaling, or it's like any other process of going inside and saying, how could I do something that would actually change the energy, change the dynamic of that situation? It's much more productive. So the complaining may get us there to some degree, just like as Lynn was saying, the complaining is sometimes a doorway for more discussion and dialogue. But not to get caught up in that pattern, because the mindsets that we spoke about that are behind the complaining are what makes it more problematic. When we get more solid in our sense of we're right, they're wrong, we need to be happy, forget about them, I don't care about their happiness. Yeah, Venerable Carol.
I was just going to mention that, maybe in connection with the idea of writing, because I've heard a lot of different ideas around journaling. But when I mentioned about just complaining to no one, one of the things that does for me sometimes is it lets me see my mind. I complain and then I think, oh, what am I complaining about? Listen to this mind.
Right,
And
right.
so it is, in a way, by verbalizing it, it takes it out of my mind, and I'm able to see just, and do something about it.
Right, right.
Where sometimes if it just sort of sits below the surface,
It could be hidden.
kind
Yeah.
of carried around. I mean, or I find myself carrying it
Mhm.
around, and I mean, this is a quirky sort of thing,
Mm.
but sometimes there's a vehicle that just gives us a chance.
That's
to
great.
actually see
Yeah.
it.
That's great.
And
Yeah.
I would agree that if you're just sort of mulling it over and over again and kind of stuck in
Right.
a victim mindset, then there's no benefit to it.
Mhm,
But
mhm.
if somehow it gives you a
Mhm.
chance to look in the mirror
Exactly.
and see something.
And I love all the laughter you're bringing to it, because that's another part of that, is when we're doing self-investigation, have some humor, folks, Don't be so deadpan serious about ourselves. Yeah. We have to look at our foibles and our faults and our silliness and, why we keep doing these things, but there is a way out, and we just have to be somewhat gentle with ourselves in the midst of that. And humor is one of the best ways to do that. Kind of go, wow, there I go again. Isn't that just bizarre? I don't know. Yeah, so I think these are great. That's a really good suggestion. Any other comments on this before we kind of talk about when others are complaining? Yes, Jack.
I have a question. I
Uh-huh.
understand all the complaining stuff that, I have to work on. But there are times where the situations seem to be so big
Right.
that just to share the situation with some close people
Mhm.
lightens the load. It may not change what's going on.
Mm.
Does that fall in the complaining category, or is there some healthiness to that?
What do people think about that? Do you want to? Do you have a specific situation in your life that you'd want to share in regard to that?
Um,
If not, that's okay. I mean,
um, pick my daughter's boyfriend.
Mhm.
Very sick, very ill.
Mhm.
Not a thing I knew about it.
Uh-huh.
But if I didn't go out and share with some people,
Right.
it would not have
Mm.
been something I could have very well dealt with.
Mm-hmm.
So
Okay.
you could be complaining about life and sickness and stuff,
Mm-hmm.
or you could be sharing just to get through.
Right. Right. And I would say it probably falls in that latter category, the way you're describing it, Jack. You know, that there are times when it does help for people to share the burden with you, to let people know what's going on in your life or the situation. Doesn't sound to me like complaining the way you described it, but let's see what some other thoughts are. You have, Venerable Lisa?
You know, if you're stuck in this situation, you've got something big going on, and you're complaining about it, I think sometimes if it's with close people, they give you a different perspective. And
Yeah.
it can kind of make you think, oh, you're right, maybe this is what I mean, you're just so focused on, you've got the blinders on, and I think when you share it with people that you trust and you trust their opinion, they can maybe shift your way of looking at it or give you some new ideas on how to deal with it or something, so I think that can be helpful in a way.
Mm-hmm. And I would say even, what you're saying too, I think, is that there are some times, just like, well, why do we have therapists and lots of other folks in the business of listening to other people, is because it does help sometimes to just be able to say that to another, to open up to the reality of our situation. Sometimes things do shift by doing that. Sometimes we have different perspectives once we've done that. But I don't know that it's necessarily complaining then. I would say complaining once more. I'll give you the dictionary definition of complaining, just so we have it. It says to express feelings of pain, dissatisfaction, or resentment, to make a formal accusation or bring a formal charge, complain of, what does this say? To make a formal protest, to state that one is suffering. This is, again, I like the idea behind this is that there is a discomfort or difficulty involved, but the complaining is getting into an expression of it that is not necessarily going to be wholesome. I do think that again, in the context of what we're talking about tonight, we're usually trying to get something out of the situation that is not realistic. What you're talking about, I think, is quite realistic. When you look at it and say, well, if I speak to other people about what's going on with the situation, there is more spaciousness around it. And there are many people in your life who, perhaps, I'm guessing, were saying, yes, talk to me any time about that, Jack. I'm happy to be a source of support for you as you go through this situation. And that's a wonderful thing. That's about connection. It's not about, making it us and them and bringing, more delusion into the scenario. I don't know. Yeah, other thoughts? Yes, I'm sorry. I can't see you there, Margaret. Blinded by the light.
So yeah, I mean, to what you're saying and to what Jack's saying, it's almost like it's more like an energy, like a feeling.
Hmm.
When it's said, it's kind of like, is it really? There's kind of like a negative or a heavy feeling.
Hmm.
Complaining, and it's like this feeling, kind of maybe not of
Hmm.
relief, but there might be some relief, but a feeling of like achiness at some point. And almost like it, even unconscious or growth in terms
Yeah.
of
more like you're looking for comfort and just to share and talk about that.
Right.
And it doesn't feel icky because there's no like really harm intended, but it's just really more for the sake of just looking for comfort.
Yeah,
It
it's
just,
more an opening of the heart.
Yeah, yeah.
It's just like a very subtle feeling. That's for me. That's how I discern it.
Right.
Not very well, but you know, that's how.
Yeah.
I think that in the complaining, I think the difference between complaining and sharing, I think that for me anyway, that the complaining has that component of that I'm a victim of something.
Right.
Whilst in sharing this heavy burden of, you know, my mother's recently passed away or my mother is deeply sick, I'm suffering and this is what's going on. I'm not feeling a victim because my mother didn't send me the letter that she promised that she was going to send me. More, I'm suffering under this burden of.
Yeah. I think that's a good assessment of it. Yeah, David.
I agree with all. Disgusting because I'm glad you shared the definition of complaining, because when I think of it, fundamentally, semantics is obviously a significant component versus sharing, and like Steve just expressed.
Right.
Complaining doesn't seem to seek a solution.
Right.
When I hear folks complaining, it's not like they want, and like you try and give them feedback, and it doesn't matter. It's not what they're looking for. I say a high percentage of the time. And then you mentioned complaint, like if you're at the target line and you've got a complaint, you're looking for some sort of resolution. But when you're just with peers, it seems like there's really not the interest in a resolution.
Right.
Maybe it's a little strong to say, but that's my impression. It's just sort of a
explosion, of resentment and what have you. Yeah, I think that's one way of delineating it. But once more, let's not get too tied into like small boxes or anything around this. But once more, the purpose of this is to look at our own behavior. And as Jack was questioning, I think it's good to examine that and say, well, when I am doing this type of thing, how do I see it? If I examine my mind and what are the thoughts behind it, is it falling into something that is of an unwholesome nature? Call it complaining, call it whatever you want. Or is it something that's much more wholesome? It's much more about reaching out and connecting and sharing suffering with others, because this is what we do as human beings, is try to be of some comfort and aid when people are suffering and going through difficulties. I think in some ways, that's... If we were to keep all that stuff to ourselves and not say anything, then we'd almost be denying people an opportunity to connect with us. And some people do that. Some people can live, very privately just to themselves. But I think we'd almost be doing a disservice to others. These are all great comments. You guys are going a lot deeper with this than I have, maybe. So let's just talk for a few minutes. We were going to try, just so you know, it's totally up to all of you. I offered to do this, and Margaret was very excited about doing it, a little slideshow from my time at Kopan Monastery. We want to do that sometime before it gets too late, so I'll try to do it as briefly as I can. But I do want to talk a little bit about when others complain, because we're sometimes on the receiving end of it. Maybe we've gotten somewhat good at starting to stop our own complaining, but we still have ears. Lama Zopa says, I can't remember, this was over the last week, I can't remember what teaching it was that Rinpoche was saying, ears are wonderful, they're here to hear problems, they're here to hear difficulties. At some level, maybe that's a good mindset to start with, is that we can be maybe able to hear the complaints of others, and in some ways just acknowledge that that's just part of, once more, being a human being in this planet. Someone's going to complain to you at one time or another. But, there are some useful things that we can do to help others when they do begin to complain, when their complaining becomes problematic from our perspective. Again, we don't know their minds absolutely. Share a few things that Venerable Thupten Chodron shared that I really like. She says, for the first one, she says, one person I know is the chief of all complainers. She is melodramatic about her ailments, sucks others into her predicaments, and tries to turn all attention to her suffering. At first I avoided her, since I disliked hearing her complaints. When that didn't work, I told her that she had nothing to complain about. Like we talked about that one, right? You have nothing to complain about, right? Everybody else is dealing with... That definitely backfired. Finally, I learned that if I earnestly smile and am playful, she actually loosens up. For example, in our classes, she would consistently be asking others to move because she was so uncomfortable. Since I sat directly in front of her, her complaints affected me. At first, my mind recoiled with, "You have more space than anyone else." Later, I became more tolerant and would joke with her about the throne she had made to sit on. I pretended to lean back and rest on her desk, which edged into my back. She would tickle me, and we'd become friends. I mean, this is very sweet. Sometimes that's an opportunity just to be more playful about it. Much humor. Bring humor into the situation, not let it become so serious. I think people get into that pattern of complaining because it just does start to become as an investment in it, if you will. And if we can kind of create some space around that, it might dismantle. Another technique is to change the subject. That works sometimes. There was one man that I was working with who lives in Lubbock, Texas, and has a pretty difficult job, and he says that they don't really get a chance to go out to eat their lunches, and so he'd have to eat his lunch with everyone else he worked with. And he said invariably he'd sit down at the table and it would just be lots of negative talk, lots of complaining, lots of stuff that just felt like it was spiraling down. And so he wondered what he could do with that. And I said, well, it might be useful to change the subject, but I suggested that he not just change the subject, but find something that people would find equally engrossing, but yet be of a more constructive nature, wholesome nature. I don't know, might be able to find such things. What I suggested to him at the time, I had just heard one of these stories about, and sometimes these morning shows on TV have the little heartfelt stories of somebody who does something really outstanding. And that story was about a man who, quite out of the blue, made a decision to donate a kidney. He had no one in his life who needed a kidney. There was no reason why he should have this compulsion to give a kidney. But out of his own kind of generosity, he decided to start this process. And his condition was that the kidney he donated, which would go to some anonymous donor, somewhere out in the world who needed a kidney that matched the kidney he was offering, that person, someone in their circle, would donate a kidney, and then that would be donated to somebody else, and someone in their circle. It's like a pay-it-forward kidney scheme or something. Organ harvesting in a kind way. Anyway, the point is this topic, I suggested that he work with this. I never got any feedback. Everybody said this is an idea. This is just something that you could throw out there, which actually I think could be an interesting discussion. People might get into, well, would you do this? And if someone in your life, received a kidney in that way from somebody who had donated it with the condition that that would you be willing to give one of your healthy kidneys for the sake of it? But anyway, the point is that if we bring in something that actually steers the conversation in a much more positive way, because when we say change the subject, I mean, you can change the subject to something that they're just going to complain about as well, right? Change the subject from politics to whatever, to the weather. I mean, you might get people complaining about the weather worse than they complain about politics. So I think we have to be real skillful in how we change the subject. And that means just being kind of having your little arsenal of stuff, if you will, that you could bring in that will steer it into, again, perhaps a more wholesome discussion. Another couple things that I think are useful, and this is maybe, again, something we might need to generate some skill, is in reflective listening, really being a good listener with somebody and trying to facilitate an investigation with that person. Reflective listening doesn't mean you're just sort of there, totally divorced from everything, but that you're actually identifying with the pain and the difficulty that person is experiencing and maybe trying to get at a deeper level of what they're seeking at that point. Like if it is somebody complaining about a life situation that is really hard for them, well, maybe what they need at that time is a more compassionate approach. Compassionate towards them, compassionate towards the situation, maybe helping that person to see the picture a little differently, to begin to work with it a little differently. So I think we can be more, active agents in listening to others and really helping them to do something more positive in the face of their pain, their difficulty. The final one that she shares, which I'll share with you, she says, sometimes we get the feelings that others complain simply to hear themselves talk, that they don't really want to resolve their difficulties. We sense that they've told the story many times in the past to various people and are stuck in a rut of their own making. In this case, I put the ball in their court by asking, what ideas do you have for what can be done? When they ignore the question and return to complaining, I ask again, what ideas do you have for what could help in this situation? In other words, I refocus them on the question at hand instead of allowing them to get lost in their, own tales. Eventually they begin to see that they could change their view of the situation or their behavior. Again, that's the two choices we have if we're really going to work with a constructor. We change the situation. We try to find some way to create a shift in that because, again, many situations are quite changeable, malleable. Or we change our minds with regard to the situation. But what she suggests here, I love this because we could actually use that for ourselves, right? Every time that the mind of complaining starts coming up, we could say to ourselves, what ideas do you have for what would actually change the situation? What is it that you would actually want to do to change the situation? Or change your mind in the face of that situation? But if we don't challenge ourselves in that way, again, we will just continue to complain, continue to have that pattern, and simply make it stronger. So any final comments or questions in regard to what I've talked about tonight? I hope this was useful. It's kind of an interesting topic, and I hope that some advice that you could work with.
I think you're assuming that people who are complaining want a solution. And that gets back to the motivation of why they're talking. And so
Yeah.
I will definitely jump in with ideas. Whether they ask for them or not.
Right.
And then when I hear the story the 10th time, over time, I go, oh.
They
I
don't
feel
want.
like a dupe in a way. Like, jeez. And in fact, it wasn't so much that they didn't do what I told them to do. Although
There is
something-
that
there's
part
something
to it.
But that they didn't do anything. And it just annoys me. So I just think, oh, I am not a good listener. Oh, I am not a good listener.
Well, I think
And
it's,
then
yeah.
I just say, well, wait a minute. Do they want to solve the problem? It's not clear.
Well, and then the question would be, and why did we want to solve the problem?
Yeah, right. Well, Oh, and actually, I'm particularly thinking of a mutual friend of ours. No. But her
Later
sto-
to be named.
Her story, I think it's because it catches me.
Uh-huh.
I mean, it's something way back in my own family's past or something. So
Yeah.
I think that's why it so gets me. Like, So yeah, that's the only. In fact, I thought that through while you were talking. Oh, that's why it's unbearable to hear this over and over again because
They're not doing anything.
Yeah.
Yeah. But this is where maybe the questioning mind is more useful.
Yeah.
Because it puts them on the spot in terms of,
I thought that was great.
yeah. The suggestions, on the other hand, make the assumption that they want to hear our suggestions, that they're going to use our suggestions, that there's even any value to our suggestions, So there's a lot more complexity when we, Yeah, it's great. It's great. That was perfect. Yeah, Sally.
I was gonna say one thing, I have a friend that complains a lot about everything.
Uh-huh.
She doesn't really wanna hear any solution, she just wants to talk, and what I finally decided to do is just after I've heard that she doesn't want any comments or
Right.
anything, is just say, I just know you're gonna figure that out and do the right thing.
Oh, that's great.
It's like
Yeah.
giving,
Some confidence.
confidence, and then that's the end of it, I mean, what else can she say?
Yeah. Oh, I think that's in the similar vein. The truth comes out. No, that's pretty good, I think, because again, it's a similar type of thing of giving them the space to find the solutions to their problems, and even what you're doing of giving them the vote of confidence that I'm sure you'll find some way to work with that. That's terrific. I think that's a much better way, again, to deal with it than, a lot of other ways that we tend to. So, good. That's great. Thanks, Sally. Yes.
Were you going to tell us about the victim we're complaining about and how we can
The victim that...
Person we're complaining about. The person that we're complaining about.
Oh, the perpetrator? Or...
We're
s-
complaining about someone.
Right.
Someone, you know,
So,
them.
so your question is how we can help them.
Yeah.
Okay.
We're complaining about.
Well, again, the person that we're complaining about, what I was saying earlier, I think, is probably the best approach, is to say, well, what is it constructively that we could do from our side that would change the situation, keeping them in mind as a part of that. Once more, the tendency that we have is we only look at it from the point of view of me. You know, here's me being harmed by this person, and I have to do what I need to do to stop that. And the complaining is coming from a place of that, as I was saying earlier, with the intention of ending that to some degree. Maybe, again, some people like to complain just for the sake of complaining and aren't really interested in it being resolved. But most of us are coming from a place of that situation having caused us some difficulty. And if it is a person, the problem is we're generally not going to come from a place of holding them in the sphere of the solution. If anything, it means Xing them so that our solution is to get them out of our lives, to, squash them, so that they're no longer doing what they're doing. But is that really the most compassionate way to work with them and benefit them? No, because we're not really helping them. We're just trying to get rid of them. And so a dialogue, as I was saying earlier, to move it from complaining into an actual constructive discussion of what's going on, to actually be able to sit down with somebody, say it is a boss or a coworker or somebody who's difficult for us, to be able to say to that person, I'd like to spend a little time talking with you about my experiences, but also getting your feedback on your experiences with me, so we can have some better understanding of who we are and a better relationship in working together, inviting that opportunity to change and shift the situation. If we have the courage and the wherewithal to do that, and the person may or may not be open to that, but we've at least extended from our side the possibility of having that type of shift or change.
What if that happened, but then they didn't listen, and so it's still...
Then it maybe takes another conversation, to say, let's talk again about what we talked about before, and I want to get your feedback and your experiences of what you're doing, and talk to you a little bit about my experiences, what I'm perceiving and doing. But always from the point of view of both of us. When we have it from the point of view of, I want you to sit down and hear what's on my mind so you can change to meet my needs, that's not going to be the right way to approach it. If we look at it from the point of view of we're both parties in this, and there are two stories. There's the story, well, there's probably four stories. There's the story of the person that they're doing over there, what they see you doing, and then there's the story of you over here thinking what you're doing as well as what you see them doing. And those are oftentimes out of sync, because we're not communicating about what's actually going on. We think they know what we're doing. We think we know what they're doing. Does that make sense? We think they know what we're doing. We think we know what they're doing. And unless you sit down and talk about it, you don't really know. So the complaining is completely avoiding all of that. It's not looking at it as something that there's any space for change in a more positive way. So that would be my suggestion. But again, I would say some situations might require perhaps some changes to that. Because if we're in a situation where there's a lot of antagonism between people, it might be useful to have a third party there. It might be useful to have some other elements that could be moderating what's going on. Because again, it's all dependent upon the degree of the situation. Because you don't want to be in a situation where perhaps you're going to feel too vulnerable, because of the dynamics of that. So it almost has to be quite situation specific. But anything that involves trying to move the situation in a more positive vein, that once more is about connectivity and interrelatedness and understanding that we're not independent, We need to work with others. We need to find more skillful ways to be in the world with others. Does this make some sense then? Yeah. Yes?
I'm just curious about how you would perceive this approach. I knew a woman in a retirement home who was very, very popular. People would go to her room and talk to her and complain. And they were satisfied, so was she. And I asked her, what do you do? She said, I just listen and I tell them all the same thing. I just tell them it wasn't your fault.
I think that the laughter's coming from a place perhaps of some of us with some Buddhist background and some other teachings that might make that sound a little...
That's why I asked it, because I was really curious. How would this be perceived?
My own understanding from the teachings of the Buddha is that would be perceived as saying something that person might gain some comfort from, but is not really in line with reality in terms of... But once more, fault is a strange word. When you say it's not your fault, I mean, well, in any of the teachings that we have in regard to karma, we aren't talking about this strong sense of fault like you're somehow a deficient person and now you're paying for all of your mistakes. It's more a matter of you are an active agent in creating the situations that you experience. And the problem is, of course, to get all that across, we were talking about this last night in San Francisco at the center, it's very difficult to talk to people about karma and about this understanding of this principle of how things come into our experience. It's a challenging topic, and people hear it. Pema Chodron, in one of her teachings, she said, when you tell me these teachings on karma, tell me again why it's not my fault. Because we hear that karma is the agent by which we have these experiences, meaning our past actions determine what we experience. And all we can hear is, it's my fault that I'm suffering. So to some degree, when you say to people, or when this woman says to people, it's not your fault, well, it's true, we don't like to think in those terms of fault. But a more constructive response might be, there is some responsibility that you played a part in this, but it's not completely your responsibility. I mean, because we are involved in very dynamic situations. It's not that it's 100% on the side of the person who did it and 0% on my side. It's not that it's 100% on my side and 0% on the other person's side. It's that it's a combination. Things come into play in very complex ways. But the sense of responsibility is more important than the sense of fault. To say, I can own this, that I created this, and I can look at this as a very interesting situation to work with, to make some modifications in how I am in the world. Does that make some sense? I don't want to go too deeply into the karma end of the pool, but
to the extent that my limited ability because of a lack of awareness of who you are and how you think allowed me to be, and I'm satisfied with that.
Okay, good. Good. Wonderful. So yeah, I would say that the comment that she's making to people, I could see where it could be quite nice for people to hear that.
Oh, yeah.
We all want to hear it, right? Not my fault. They're all wrong. The whole world is against me, and I'm just, innocent little me over here. But that's not really accurate. But once more, we shouldn't drive it into this rubbing somebody's nose and it being a fault, because fault almost has a connotation of we're sort of somehow inherently wrong, inherently evil, inherently bad. And it's just conditions, just causes and conditions, all very workable, all very flexible. We're all works in progress. I'll say what I said the other night, wherever it was. I'm losing track of where I said what. It's very easy to do when you're teaching at a couple of different centers and what have you. But Suzuki Roshi looked out at a group of students once and said, "You're all perfect just as you are, and you could use a little work." So we have to hold that kind of idea that at the center of our being is something we can trust in that is good and pure and wholesome. And yet we do have to do the work. There's some perfection there, but there's also works in progress, Well, we should probably end if we're going to do the little slideshow. Any of you who want to leave, you're certainly welcome. I won't be offended in any way, but I'll try to make it as brief as I can. Let's just have a few thoughts at the end of the teaching, though, in order to kind of put a conclusion to our time together this evening and think about the last hour and 45 minutes or so that we've examined this topic. And you might even, just as an exercise, think of one thing from this last bit of time we spent together that you would like to retain and work with hopefully you can retain a lot from what we went through tonight. But it's good to pick just one thing to work on, something that came to mind during the teachings tonight that you think will help you yourself in your own life to diminish that tendency of complaining, or perhaps to be better on hearing complaining from others. Something that you can walk away from this teaching with that will help you to change your mind and therefore also change the effect you have on others. And having done that, think that through everything that we've done here tonight, all the words that have been said that you've listened to, those of you who have shared words with others, all the thoughts that you've had while you've been here, that from all of this, we want to create the most positive idea that we could through the force of what we've done here tonight, create welfare for both ourselves as well as all sentient beings, that we can have the most positive effect we can imagine on the world and all the beings in it. Okay, good enough. Thank you.